Welcome everyone to this episode number 15 of the lockdown. And today I'm joined by a very good friend of mine, David Burkus. He's a professor in management psychology, organizational psychology, a thought leader, has written many of my favorite books. We're going to talk today about his latest book, which is about to come out, but also reference his books and work on creativity, networking, and the latest book, which is on leading from anywhere, leading virtually, the work and the world of kind of talent and leadership and the new abnormal, where the office might be extinct or defunct forever. So David, it's a pleasure to have you here. How are you today?
I'm good. Life is good here. It's winter time, but it's still probably 50 degrees or so Fahrenheit. So it's sun is shining, which actually means it's hard to get camera light going in this office. But other than that, man, I'm good. I have nothing to complain about.
No need to show off, given that it's a lot colder where I am today. But yeah, point well taken. The question that I ask every guest slash friend slash thinker when I start this conversation is what they've learned about themselves during, this lockdown months or kind of a pandemic phase, and what they learned about the general state of humanity. So it's a kind of two-part question.
Yeah. So what I've learned about myself, a couple different things. I'm not all that good at teaching kindergarten. I learned that pretty much by April. I learned, the interesting one, we had a conversation about this, I think back and forth via email. I never thought about it this way, but I learned that, at least for me, business travel was my number one source of self-care, right? I'm fortunate enough to live in the middle of the country. Most business trips were one, maybe 2 nights max. It wasn't this fly out Sunday, don't come back till Thursday thing. And then when I had that taken away from me, I got really, really stressed, and I couldn't figure out why for about 2 months. And then I pulled out instinctively, I whipped out my phone and I went right to the American Airlines app, and there were no itineraries. And that was sort of the moment that I had this realization of like, I kind of need this in my life. I mean, I don't need it, but I built over 10 years this sort of reliance on those little micro trips. So I learned that, and I've had to find new ways to do that to stay sane. About humanity as a whole, I don't know. I learned, I wrote this little audio project last year that ended up being this 2-hour-long book with Audible called Pick a Fight, which was about how common opponents, common causes, common fights for justice in the world, et cetera, can really bond a people group. And I saw that in April with the coronavirus. And it got really, really excited at one point because it felt like the whole world was united in that. But I kind of lost that by June. And it seemed like it turned into like keeping the score on which countries and which states and which whatever was doing. And like, no, that's not the point. But I'm optimistic. As we're recording this, we have 3 potential vaccines all developed inside of 9 months, which is an astounding pace and shows what happens when the whole world is united in that common cause. So I guess I'm optimistic again, but I really hit a trough there in July, August, especially leading up to November here in the US. But I think it's back. I think I'm optimistic about that again.
Okay, well, then obviously you've managed to stay very productive. You're productive all the time. I follow you on social media, and you're a prolific author. But the fact that you've already written, and it's about to come out, a book that actually is very much linked to the pandemic is amazing and very interesting. And I had the pleasure of reading the manuscript, which you clearly kindly shared with me. I know it's a book that will appeal to HR leaders in general who are trying to reimagine work and the work contract in this new time and whatever times might come or shape up. How did you think about the book? What was the process for deciding to do this book? And given that things are still changing, is there anything that you would revise, revisit, or change in this book already?
Oh, I'm sure there's stuff I've revised. I don't know that I've found it yet, right? I mean, this is the worst part about a book is that it's never finished. It's just printed, right? And then I wrote a book on creativity 7 years ago that talked about the study that if you get a little bit tipsy, you're more creative. Well, that actually just failed replication, right? So 7 years later, I would go back and change that.
Don't tell me that. I don't want to hear this, even though I haven't been doing the a little bit part very
okay,
well.
All right. So, a lot of it came out of looking at, I had come out of the Pick a Fight, the audiobook project, sort of done with that, looking around. And then obviously this unignorable thing happened, but it actually came out from a collaboration between my publisher and I. We were talking about a totally different book about teams. And as we were talking about it, we started to realize that, well, the real opportunity here is we're not all coming back. Like we started conversations around this book in May, and May was about when I saw that this is not send everyone home for 2 weeks, right? When 15 days to flatten the curve turned into like 90, it became apparent that we're not going to be able to send 70 million people to work from home and then call them all back, right? So we started talking about, well, what do you need to do to keep a team together, all of that. And so the whole project morphed. We never ended up signing a deal on the original book we were talking about. We signed this one instead, June 2nd. And I had until July 31st to write the whole thing, which was an insane pace. We went on a vacation at one point in June, and I don't remember much of it. Apparently my boys and my wife had a great time though. Maybe because I wasn't there, because I was in the spare bedroom in the house that we rented, writing the whole time.
And presumably the short window was so that it can come out as early as possible, and it will come out in January or February 2021.
Yeah, January 5th. So we picked we kind of combination reverse engineered and picked the date, right? We wanted to get it out as quickly as possible with printing contracts, and books are already sometimes 18 months in advance contracted with the printers and all that sort of thing. So finding space in their production cycle, et cetera, we looked at the earliest possible we could do it was January 5th, and then we worked backwards from there. And that set a target date of basically August 1st of having to finish it to get into editing and all of those cycles. We didn't skip any of those stages you're used to. I think that might be the other thing I learned, by the way, about this world, is that the publishing world doesn't need to take 18 to 24 months to write a book. It just does, right? Because we did this in 6.
Yeah, and for sure, everyone talks about COVID accelerating this, that, etc. Publication times have definitely been accelerated during the pandemic, right? Things are faster now.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a good thing. The interesting thing that was happening already in the publishing world is that the self-publishers or the contracted hybrid publishers you could go to and work with had already speeded up their cycle times. So if you had the money and you wanted to pay somebody else to print your book, you can do it in 6 months. The big 5, the traditional publishers, were headed for a world where they're going to have to keep up. I think they probably saw themselves having a few more years. Well, that's not true anymore. But like you said, that's like most things with the pandemic. Whatever was on the horizon 5 or 10 years from now is now.
Yeah. So tell us about the book, the title, subtitle, and the kind of how would your elevator kind of pitch or summary, and then we'll dive into some of the sections that I found were really, really important.
Yeah, well, the way that I say it often is that the future of work isn't office versus home versus whatever. It's work from anywhere. You don't send 70 million people away to work from home for 9 months and then call them all back. They're going to want greater flexibility. And that was already happening. Top talent has needed organizations less than organizations need top talent for decades now, right? But why would you willingly go back to Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, when this has proved you don't necessarily need that? I'm not bearish on offices. I think for most large organizations, they're still going to be there, partly because contracts or leases and things like that are 10 or 20 year cycles. But also, I mean, I'm a social creature. I can't wait to get back to conferences and those sort of things. And the idea of going to an office 2 or 3 times a week for certain meetings and to be able to see colleagues is great. But I don't want to go there all the time. Even you and I are probably similar in this. Even when we were working as professors sort of full time, I don't want to be on campus full time. I want to be on campus, but not all the time. And I think that's where most people are going. So it's much less about how do we lead a fully virtual team, although the book can help you there. And it's much more about how do you learn the lessons from companies and research that's been done on fully distributed teams for this new world where you're only going to see your people once a week, maybe a couple times a month. Are you going to be able to get the team together all of the time? What lessons from this other world of virtual work can we bring over into that work from anywhere world?
And so the book is called Leading from Anywhere.
Yeah, Leading from Anywhere, the essential guide to leading remote teams or managing remote teams or something like that. It's the from anywhere that I really emphasize, because that's where I think we're headed. January, but even into 2021 and beyond, I don't know. There will always be a remnant, probably a third to a half of people who don't go back to the office Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day.
Yep, yep. And so I like, the way that you basically highlight the fact that a lot of things that seem very novel have been going on for ages, right? And I think in the first chapter, the title or main kind of mantra is the rise and fall and rise of virtual teams, right? And you talk about how Peter Drucker in the early 90s basically said that commuting to an office would be obsolete or already seemed like a stupid idea back then, way before the digital revolution. But then you talk about how Marissa Mayer, when she started, said, we need to rebuild Yahoo, everyone meets face to face. I mean, during the beginning, the early stages of the pandemic, most of the executives I spoke to were either the first ones back in the office or couldn't wait for offices to reopen and people to go back in, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the misconceptions and the facts about the need to be in versus not, how it affects productivity, and what leaders should understand about the research.
Yeah, I mean, most of it is a misconception. There's definitely things that are heightened by being in the same physical room together that we don't have virtual replications for, right? So there's a whole chapter in the book about what to do if you need to problem solve or think creatively remotely. But I actually don't recommend that. I think that's something that we still don't have good enough technology to run a virtual brainstorming session on, right? So those problem solving meetings, those sort of things. I think we talk a lot in the book about the need for teams to develop cadence, to understand how each other's work styles and preferences are. And that happens faster in an in-person environment. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does happen faster. But to be honest with you, I think the biggest thing is holdovers from the sort of Frederick Taylor era, right? I mean, I talked about this in Under New Management, that we dragged his manual with us from the factory to the office. And there's still a lot of middle managers, senior leaders who equate presence with productivity. And when we were forced to move into this work from home world, for a lot of people, that presence piece was gone. Responsiveness became the new form of presence, which is a whole other thing, and the reason for our sort of summer slog in this work from home, right? April, May, it was working. June, July, we all got burnt out because we realized a lot of people, responsiveness was the new form of showing that you were the hard worker that came right before the boss and that sort of thing. So I think that is a big misconception in a lot of people's minds, that you can judge who your most productive people are by your people who were there all the time. And that was never actually true. It might even be the flip side of your ideas around competence versus confidence, right? If you don't have either, then just show up all the time, and at least people will think you're a hard worker, even if you're hanging out on YouTube the whole time. So that's a misconception that, unfortunately, I think it's kind of on its knees, but it's not fully submitted yet, because that responsiveness piece. But we'll get there. If you would have said in January of 2020 that to a senior leader, I'm going to send 50% of your workforce home to work from home for 9 months and things are going to be okay, most of them wouldn't believe you. And yet here we are, we're greater numbers than that. And things, took some pain points and that sort of thing, but 9 months out, it's working for a lot of people. It took a while to rework their lives, but it's working.
So you reference recent statistics and figures from Gallup and others showing that engagement levels, satisfaction levels are basically up in general, right?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the Gallup survey in particular, that was actually BC. That was before Corona. That was published, probably conducted in December and January, published in February. So, while it was kind of this thing we were paying attention to, but lots of people were telling us it wasn't going to be a big deal back then, right? And the interesting thing to note there, and this is why I'm really big on the from anywhere instead of from home versus office, is that the most engaged people were the ones who were at the office maybe 1 to 2 days a week, right? So fully remote had less engagement, fully at the office had less engagement than the people who had the freedom to be there. I think what speaks to that is we already know there's huge correlations between giving people autonomy over the environment that they work in and their levels of engagement. So I think that's what's driving it. And that's the piece that I don't see people giving up after a year of doing it when they come back and go, nope, you got to get back to your cube. I don't see it happening. There's more research on an individual level that it takes some time for people to find the patterns of productivity. So we know right when the pandemic started, people just worked longer hours, right? They started work when they would normally leave for their commute. They kept working until they would normally be home from their commute. And that's what increased the productivity. But over 9 months, they went through the slog of being burned out from doing that too much and then really reworking their lives. So it's that work-life integration we all preached about in 2010 finally forced to happen. And so no surprise that people end up more productive on the other end of that.
Yeah, and the trend you highlight, I read, I think, a recent Glassdoor study that also suggests that it's something like 20% of people want only working from home, or want basically the disappearance of the office. 70% want a hybrid, so they want the options, and then 10% want office only, right? So it
Yeah.
seems like people want more flexibility. Now, are you optimistic about the fact that this could encourage, nudge, or even force organizations to move beyond presentism and get their act together to focus more on what people actually contribute, because they could have done it before and they didn't? I mean, is
Right.
this a chance?
It's a chance. Am I optimistic? Are 100% of managers going to abandon it? No. But I think the majority of them are. I think a lot of them realize I need to focus more on outcomes and less on monitoring my activity. I'll say though that even that got challenged. I mean, the stocks and the revenue figures and the sales figures for companies that make spying software and other stuff in April and May really shocked me, right? And then every once in a while you see these articles. Now and I don't want to name the company, partly because I don't know and partly to protect the guilty, that is using facial recognition algorithms to judge not just do you have the right windows open on your computer, but can I see your face in the webcam to prove that you're actually there and working. That's a terrible idea. And unfortunately, a lot of people, though, are going to chase that comfort of that can be measured, therefore I'll use it. But the ones who didn't have that, maybe because their company didn't buy it quick enough, or maybe because they decided this is the chance to focus on outcomes and not activity, are seeing a lot better results. And so I think a lot of those people are going to have to do that, right? And then also, I don't think it's necessarily fair if my metric on the days when a colleague of mine is in the office is, are they present? And my metric when they're out of the office is their face on the webcam. I don't think those things mesh. So I think it's actually harder to measure if you're giving that person flexibility, and that'll help too.
Makes sense. Let's talk about the role of the leader or the manager, if you prefer. I mean, do you see a possibility or the potential where people who were people or people person and charismatic, interpersonal, who walk the floor and had good relationships are suddenly struggling because you take that kind of analog element of interaction away, and they need to be able to learn how to empathize on Zoom or Teams? And is that happening? Could that happen? Could maybe good managers become bad, and maybe even the reverse? Bad managers who are kind of geeky and introverted and like to be in front of the computer suddenly have a possibility to thrive?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I was never all that persuaded by the idea that management by walking around made for great managers, right? Because it depended on what you learned from that. It could also make for micromanagers, right? And I'm really not. In fact, I'm openly persuaded by the research that suggests that personality styles don't really have much to do in how effective you are as a manager. I mean, there's no perfect personality style. There might be a perfect personality style for that team and that type of work. So, I'm optimistic there. I will say a lot of the people person managers, when this whole experiment started, really doubled down on check-ins and the one-on-ones and let's jump on Zoom every day. And I think the smart ones who were actually capable of empathy realized pretty quickly that doesn't work, that I need to give my people the frequency of these check-ins that they need. Some people do need the everyday. Some people, maybe it's once a week. Some people it's every day, but it's every day via email. And then, I mean, a lot of the top performers, it's almost like circle back with me on Friday afternoon and we'll exchange an email about what I did this week, right? And that's it. And so I think that the savvy people person managers figured that out. I think the ones that were just sort of relying on charisma and management by walking around as a proxy for the whole presenteeism, et cetera, that we were talking about, yeah, they're absolutely struggling, but maybe they deserve it. So there's that issue.
Could it be that engagement levels are up because if a lot of people had bad managers and they don't have to see them for 8 or 9 months, they're happier? Could that be an effect?
It's certainly possible. One thing I've never understood. So let me back up. So I for the last 15 years have trained in a really esoteric Brazilian martial art or Brazilian jiu-jitsu. That's where these things came from. And it's at least in the part of the world that I live in, it's a very sort of blue collar sport. Most of the practitioners, we get a couple people like me and doctors and lawyers, but mostly it's a lot of blue collar folks. And I've always thought something was interesting there. As much as I love to talk about engaging and purpose and, having the team bond and all that sort of thing, there's an undeniable percentage of employees who just want to show up and do a good job and leave and go to their real life, right? Who actually do have that mental separation between their work and life. I don't think it's the majority, but they do exist. And those type of people, I think, really thrive to the extent that their job could actually be from home, right? So if they were more if you were working in a factory, it's kind of hard to do that remotely, but there are people who are managing shop floors, et cetera, that are there less often, et cetera. I think actually, yes, those people probably improved because they felt like all of this stupid stuff that managers were asking me to do, now I don't have to do. I can just focus on the work. I don't think it's the majority, but I do feel like as an industry, right, organizational psychology, we have ignored those people for a long time in favor of all of these ideas. And so, yeah, it's certainly possible.
Speaking of wrongly ignoring some people and ideas, I like the section you have in your book on psychological safety, talking about Amy Edmondson's work and, why is safety so important and what happens to building safety when, we can't meet in person and when everything is remote or virtual?
Yeah. So, I would argue building that sense of psychological safety matters even more, right? If you were too afraid to speak up or to take risks in an in-person meeting, there are much more barriers. It's much easier to hide in a Zoom call. I actually did a training with a couple managers last week, and the number one question I got was, how do I convince my people to turn their cameras on during our meetings? And it's kind of that weird situation where you want to be like, well, you already you failed 3 steps back, right? Because there isn't enough psychological safety, et cetera. So it matters much more in that capacity, right? To the extent that which brilliance comes from usually the fringes of consensus, we need that, especially now. It's also a lot harder to build. My number one tip for leaders who are wanting to build that psychological safety piece has a lot to do with you and actually appointing kind of a watcher, so that when you're running that meeting, there's someone watching you for, are you accidentally communicating a little bit of disrespect, right? I come from the Northeast of the US and now I live in the South. This is a lesson I had to learn pretty fast, that the dry, sarcastic, we in Boston especially, we show love by hassling each other, right? And that's not really the way it works here in the South. Here in the South, the sweetest words you'll ever hear are actually insults, things like bless your heart, right? So you have to learn those things and realize you might accidentally be conveying disrespect, and then that trickles down to the rest of the team. I think you also have to learn that the way you respond when someone does speak up, if you respond with judgment right off the bat versus a consideration, a willingness to try, et cetera, that'll build trust over time. And those things matter more when you're doing that whole meeting on a Zoom call than they do in the in-person, because you get a lot more feedback about what you might have accidentally said when you're in person that you don't get when you're all looking at a bunch of different, and let's be honest, most of us are looking at ourselves most of the time on these calls, right? The number one motion I see on a Zoom call is someone checking their hair because they see themselves more than anything else. So those things matter kind of even more, and it makes the leader's role in how they're conducting these meetings with trust and respect and demonstrating that much more important. So I sort of see it as not only is Amy Edmondson's work really important, but Christine Porath's work on civil behavior and uncivility in the workplace. That's like the power duo for me right now for a virtual team, is we need to nail those two things and a lot of stuff will take care of itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's talk about something else. And you mentioned already your book on creativity, Myths of Creativity, which I love. And every time I do a session with my students on creativity, we go through some of the kind of myths, and it's a great book. What happens to working creatively or teams that need to produce creative or innovative work when they're only virtual or remote? And I know you know this well, there is a long and well-established literature on virtual teams working remotely, but I also wonder how applicable is that research to this new phase of working remotely or virtual, which we often don't have a choice to meet or is just virtual and you have to interact with people you never met in person. So say a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'll say that an interesting thing there is that you're exactly right. There was an assumption when we talked about and did a lot of research on virtual teams, especially at the senior levels, What that actually meant was we meet 3 or 4 times a year in person, and then we communicate via email and maybe a couple Zoom meetings or WebEx. Do you remember WebExes? Man, that technology was frustratingly bad.
Well, you said that I had to do 2 WebEx with clients I won't mention last week because, they're a bit traditional, let's say.
Right. So we have much better tools now. I still think we don't have the tools to really replicate what we would call a good brainstorming session in person. And actually, that's okay, because brainstorming was never the entirety of problem solving, right? So I actually think the best thing that the forced virtual experiment we're all going through will do for teams' creativity is it'll force them to think about, we can't just call one quick meeting and spit out ideas, right? And so in the book, I talk about how if you're really needing to solve a problem as a team, it's actually 3 meetings, right? You need to spend adequate time researching the problem. And that's probably a different meeting, or maybe it's not even a meeting. Maybe it's a week where we're all committing to having individual conversations with stakeholders and people who can see the problem, and then coming back together for a quick dialogue to capture that. Even if we move from into a second meeting where we're coming up with ideas, I mean, there was a lot of research that was really hard for folks studying creativity to reconcile around. You know, the studies about, it'd be easier if everybody just brainstormed individually and then we added it up later. And I think a lot of those studies, and people like myself, Bob Sutton, argued this a long time ago. What a lot of those studies miss is that the real genius of a brainstorming session is when ideas merge and when they combine and when there's friction, and then that spits out a better idea on the back end. And that's what we're going to try and replicate virtually, but we don't want to start a lot of times from the position of we need to talk about the problem and solve the problem in the same meeting. We want to have those as 2 different meetings, have a definitive problem statement, maybe even tell people, come with a couple ideas already, and let's get right into the sharing piece so we can skip right to that collision, which is great. And then usually it depends on the team. The decision making is probably its own meeting with a smaller group of people who are actually in charge of implementation, et cetera. So if that happens, this is a great thing for creativity and innovation in a virtual setting, because it gives us time to draw out a process that teams, as prolifically creative teams, always knew that creativity was a process, whether that's design thinking or Sawyer's 8 stages or any of them. Nobody ever said that all you need to know about creativity in business is get your people in a boardroom with a whiteboard marker and go to town coming up with ideas. And yet that's how most people ran it in the old environment. So I'm optimistic for what it forces us to do if it forces us to think about it as a process instead of just one meeting.
And so in your other book, Friend of a Friend, you sort of decode and, in essence, highlight important findings around the science of networking. And again, there's now so much discussions on what happens to that, how you network, make connections, and thrive in what we could see as good office politics when you take away the office and when everything is virtual and remote. Talk a little bit about that, networking in general, and especially if you think about young people who are starting a new job, a new career. Maybe they started already 7 or 8 months ago and they've never met anyone in person, and they have to kind of create the reputation, meet the right people. What happens to us in this new world of work?
Yeah, I'll do you one better. Last week, I gave a presentation for a group who the people operations manager had been hired after the forced work and then it was her idea to start doing these regular monthly series. And I was the first person she was bringing in. And I was thinking, man, a lot of pressure, because not only do they not know me, they don't know you either, right? And you're calling them into this meeting. In terms of building networks, whether it's office politics and that or larger career networking, the interesting thing is we knew this ahead of time. Most people build their networks organically, right? One of the most fascinating studies on networks and collaboration wasn't conducted in business, but it was conducted in academia. And it showed that people are much more likely to co-publish a paper, professors are, with someone whose office is located closer to them, right? Even if they're at a university where there's a different professor who would have been a better collaborator, proximity to where my office is makes me more likely. And I think that's generalizable to the office situation as well, right? If it's a shorter walk to this person and they can solve my problem 80% of the way, I probably do it. And we already know that a lot of people build our networks through our existing friends. That's why the book's called Friend of a Friend. We also know that was never actually that great of a strategy, right? That you lose a lot of diversity in your network by doing that, that you probably can't find information as well, that a lot of the people that are around you think the same way or maybe have the same solutions. So a much more deliberate strategy was always the better idea. Now you sort of have to, right? And in fact, one of the big arguments in Friend of a Friend that I make is that I think we got Mark Granovetter's study about the strength of weak ties and later studies about dormant ties all wrong. Because the lesson isn't, when I'm looking for a job, email old colleagues from 5 years ago, which is the lesson everybody said. The lesson is develop a system where you're keeping in touch with those people all of the time. And now that we're in this virtual world, we almost have to. I mean, my favorite thing to tell people to do is, and you could get away with this anytime between March and I don't know, whenever there's a vaccine and we're all at work again some of the time. But even then, it'll probably work. As long as there is this epidemic sort of lingering, you can email people and go, hey, I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. I was thinking about you today and I hope you're well. And it used to be that if you send that, people thought you were about to beg them for an introduction or try and recruit them to your network marketing company or something crazy like that. And now everybody realizes that that's kind of how we make touch points with each other and how we springboard conversations. So that piece becomes even more important, especially even in an office concept. Those little meetings when you're on the line with somebody who might be the senior executive and they reveal a small thing about maybe their personal life that you connected with, maybe you both like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example, that could now be a bridging off point to reaching back out to them 3 months later. Hey, I know you love this sport and I saw this article about it. I thought I'd send it along. Just those little things go a long way to keeping those connections alive. And when you can't rely on seeing them every day, you're going to have to be deliberate about those.
I remember seeing some research, I think possibly by Microsoft in the early stages of this, showing that people are collaborating more with those who are far away, in other geographic locations, of course. And you talk in the book about the water cooler effect and whether we need a digital water cooler. I mean, You made a very interesting point right now. Maybe this is good for diversity in the sense that it's forcing you to think about working or interacting with people who are not just next door in your same office or in the same water cooler.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways it can go, right? So I'm optimistic in the first way. I mean, I wrote about this in Under New Management, the idea that forward-thinking companies were changing the org chart, and instead of making the job or the person the building block, they were making the project the building block, and then assembling a team of people out of our database of employees, but also freelancers and other stuff. And this world heightens that, right? It's actually easier. It's never been easier to do that, including across geographic boundaries and business units and that sort of thing. So I'm optimistic there. I'm fearful, though, that when we get into a situation where we are work from anywhere, where some of the people are there, that 10% is there 5 days a week, that 80% is there or 70% is there half time and working from home or from a co-working space that's just closer to their house or whatever. And then that there's another 10 to 20% that are work from home always. I worry that it will be very easy for us versus them that always happens in organizations. The silos that always happen in organizations will move from who's co-located and how co-located are they, right? So the us might start to be the people I see 4 days a week instead of the people I see 2 days a week. And I worry about that effect on proximity. My hope is we can manage the change quickly enough, right? That we can realize there's massive benefits to not thinking geography is how we need to build our teams, because we've proven we can build them from anywhere around the world. The only thing we got to figure out is time zones, but Google solves that pretty quickly. Beyond that, so my hope is we could solve that problem sort of before we come back into whatever the new abnormal is, to steal your term. And that we don't let that creep in. But like I said before, I'm not a naive optimist. There will be some organizations that fail, and then that'll be the new us versus them, is who's co-located all the time and who's not.
What do you think happens to business travel? As someone who has used to spend a lot of time traveling to give talks, and obviously in the last 8 months, I assume you did pretty much everything virtually, which has, its advantages, but then, you also miss the action and the kind of, I always said, being an HR speaker is like rock and roll minus the rock and roll part. Rock and roll, you're on the road, it's tiring, but no fame, money, sex, drugs, or rock and roll. But other than that, it's the same, right?
Maybe you need Maybe you need to speak at marketing conferences. I feel
Yeah,
like
maybe
it's
that's
no.
right. Can you see consultants and thought leaders who are eager to return to the analog speaking circuit, giving a fee that is lower for in person if it gets them out of the house and they can go far away than
Yeah,
virtual.
I mean,
The
so
other way around the world.
right. No, in some ways that's already happening. I with respect to Bill Gates, which is always a bad idea to disagree with Bill Gates, I don't believe that business travel will be cut in half. I think the number he gave is 50% reduction. I don't believe that. I do believe that sales call business travel, right? Going to client sites, consultants who used to go leave every Sunday and come back every Thursday now might do that once a month instead of every week. That business travel will come down. I actually think, and maybe this is just me being a people person and an extrovert, I think whenever it's safe, whenever the consensus is it's safe, I think we're going to have a hard rebound in professional conferences, association conferences, et cetera. So I think that's actually going to increase and it's going to offset it. So there probably is a reduction, maybe 30%, 40% overall. But I don't think it's 50. And I am actually really optimistic about conferences and those sort of things. We want to be around each other again. I should also run the flip side of that, which is even in organizations, the annual senior leaders meeting that we do in La Jolla every year, et cetera, that might move to virtual because it's, again, more efficient. But the actual professional associations and those sort of things, by 2022, 2023, by when I can't even say that, right? Because 1918 Spanish flu was like a 2-year long ordeal. So I can't pick a time. But whenever it's over, I think people are going to want to gather again. They're just going to gather for more often for fewer purposes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Hey, and at the end, I'm going to ask you to, I can see a real physical copy of your book in the back, right? And it's
Yeah.
not just a real background. So, if you can bring it at some point, then show it.
Yeah. This is not a virtual background.
Exactly.
I can grab any of this stuff.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
I got the, so I apologize
for physical book and a real background. It's amazing.
Weird, right? No, it's actually a green screen and that one was just hanging. No, I'm kidding. No, I just got those literally Friday. We were headed out for date night and the UPS guy flagged me down as we were leaving the house and gave me a big thing. So I finally got them, but gives you an idea of how short a time frame we're working in. The book comes out in like 3 weeks and we just now have print copies.
Yeah. Hey, I have just a couple more questions. One that, I think I wanted to bring up because we spend a lot of time chatting or emailing, about media coverage of various, types of leaders, more in the realm of politics or famous leaders. And even though we are pretty much at the opposite end of kind of the political spectrum, more often than not, we end up agreeing, mostly because we see that people's perceptions of leaders and their performance is not as rational or data-driven as it could be. And I think, I find it quite nice and sort of at least intellectually comforting that you can agree on so many different case studies when you have different political views or ideologies. We talk about the world becoming more and more polarized and people antagonizing and everyone talks about divisiveness, etc. Do you see a deterioration in people's willingness to pay attention to what leaders actually produce, their performance? Is it just pure partisanship, or do you think there's a way to kind of reconcile this?
I think there's a way to reconcile it. I'm not entirely sure I know how, and I think the pandemic makes it harder, right? So I actually wrote about this. I started sort of studying this, and I know politics for me was sort of a spectator sport, but like a sport I didn't care about, like baseball, right? I'd sort of pay attention, et cetera. And then something really interesting happened, which was in 2016. I mean, a lot of interesting things happened, but in particular in November, I was already contracted to write Friend of a Friend, which is a book about networks, connections, communities. So obviously you read stuff like Putnam's Bowling Alone, and you read The Big Sort, which is a fascinating book that details about a 40-year-long study of how people had been geographically relocating based on political ideologies, not at a state level, but at a zip code and a neighborhood level, right? So and it's not like I'm giving a survey to the HOA to figure out who they voted for before I move into the neighborhood. But if I'm driving around the neighborhood and there's a bunch of Subarus, I got a pretty good idea of where they stand versus if there's a bunch of Ford F-150s, right? And I also grew up in the Northeast, and now I live in the middle. I live in Oklahoma, right? The middle of smack dab in the middle of the country. And I was fascinated the day after the 2016 election, how many people, most of the people that I lived near were not surprised at all. They knew it was coming forever. They didn't know. I don't think anybody knew, but that was their guy, and they knew he was going to win forever. And then everybody in the Northeast was like, I don't even know anyone who voted for this person. How could he win? And I thought that was like, literally in that moment, I was like, this needs to be a chapter. And I've been watching it ever since, right? This sort of polarization side. I think what causes it is a couple different things. I think certainly most of us, and we commiserate about this often because this thinkers and public intellectuals are not exempt from this. I think most often we pick our team for one issue, and then the team tells us how to think for all of the other issues, right? So name your social or economic issue, you move to one or the other side in the United States, and then you look to that side to educate you on how to think about this other issue, right? With the exception of a very small percentage of people who've managed to hold the line on being fervently identified as libertarians, the rest of the country picks their team, and then the rest of it picks for them. And that's a big problem. But I think the other thing is that relocation piece, and the pandemic, by making everybody sort of work from home, be at home more often, and turn to things like social media, probably could have smashed that barrier. But unfortunately, the algorithms there are geared just like we act in human life, which is to gravitate towards people who think like us, act like us, because clearly they're brilliant, right? We love people that think like us for that reason. So can we get out of it? Yes, because I think a lot of people don't realize that what we're actually arguing about is details. Most of us all want the same thing, right? We want equality of opportunity across the nation. We argue about how to achieve it, right? We want racial equality and gender equality. We argue about how to achieve it. We want to grow GDP, but also grow standards of living and happiness. We argue about how to achieve it. And I hope we could have those conversations a bit more. It's one of the reasons I like, even though we disagree so often, your focus has been on the competence piece. Let's judge the results, because that has to do with the actual policy. Did it actually work? Not did you say it well in a debate, right? I don't know what it's going to take to get more people to think about it that way. But I am in short term, I'm very pessimistic about it. Long term, I'm optimistic because pendulums swing, and there'll be something that brings us back. I don't know what it was. I thought the pandemic might have been it. Historically in the United States, it's usually like a world war or a Cold War. And I hope that's not what it is, but I don't know what it is.
Well, maybe this should be the next book. Oh, and speaking of which, what's next for you, not just in terms of writing, but, thinking, activities, what plans have you got that you can share with us?
Yeah, well, this one started out as a book on teams, and then had to be a book on virtual teams, because that's what most people needed. I think we're years away from really feeling like we've gotten it. So this is my focus, 2021, 2022. And then I think it'd be fun to go back and revisit that, to go back and look at, I mean, there's so many books on here's how to have a great team and teamwork and that sort of thing. And they're all conjecture. There's very little actual data, right? And even the data that we have, sometimes it wasn't run all that well, et cetera. So I think that would be a lot of fun to do. But I'll be honest, my focus so far has been, I've made investments in my webcams and all of that sort of stuff, because it's going to be on this virtual teams thing. And then probably teaching that virtually and speaking on that virtually for a long time as well.
Okay, well, I'll sure pick your recommendations on the technical kind of gadgets that I need to get, and we can follow up on that. Hey, why don't you hold the book so I do a screenshot, which then will become, that's it, but not in front of your face. That's it. Next to it is better. Okay, here we go. 1 second.
Or I should do that.
Okay,
right?
1, 2, yeah, 3. There you go. Thank you, David. A great pleasure as always. And who knows when we're going to be able to meet in person next time, but I'm sure we'll value it even more. In the meantime, happy holidays, all the best. And we look forward to seeing the book out in January.
Yeah, you too. And thank you so much for having me.